The first thing to know is how blogs make money. If you run a blog, you can sell advertisements. This is usually done per impression, which means an advertiser will pay you every time someone on your blog sees their ad, or per click, which means you get paid if a user on your blog clicks the ad. But another important way that blogs make money is by getting purchased. For instance, Huffington Post launched in 2005 with a $1 million investment, but it sold to AOL in 2011, so just 6 years later, for $350 million. At the time of that sale, the annual ad revenue was $31 million. Quite a lot, but if you think about it, that means the sale price was more than 10 times the annual ad revenue. The reason AOL was interested in this was not just the ad revenue, as substantial as it was, they also wanted to bring in the name brand of Huffington Post and even acquire Arianna Huffington herself, because she was very influential and prominent at the time. That's blogs. What about bloggers? How do they make money? Well, in the early days, there was usually a flat rate for bloggers with a required minimum number of articles, or they were paid per post, so per article that they wrote. It was a small amount. In the mid-2000s, it varied, but it was around $5 or $10 per article. A big shift happened when Gawker started to pay monthly salary with bonuses for page views. Page views means anytime someone looks at the article, they click on your blog post. In fact, Gawker installed a large monitor in their main office showing a live tally of all the page view statistics for all the Gawker bloggers and their stories so that everyone working there can see which stories are trending and going popular, which bloggers are writing lots of stories that are getting popular. It became really the analytification or the datafication of the blogging industry, focusing entirely on numbers and specifically page view. This Gawker switch from per post, where you are paid per article, to per page view, meaning how many people look at your article, this payment policy spread very quickly across the entire blogging industry. Now, if you think about it, this sort of blogger remuneration is reductionist. All that matters is how many clicks the headline draws, not the quality or accuracy of the article itself. Right? If once someone clicks an article, even if it's trash and they're uninterested and they turn away, a click is still registered. That a click is a page view. Therefore, value has been provided, and advertisers are interested in getting people to look at their ads. Therefore, they want as many people as possible to go to the post where the ads are displayed. Now, this choice of metric, it wasn't an automatic or a given, but it really was a choice that bloggers are funded by page views. It really significantly shapes the entire blogosphere and online news industry. We'll get to more details of this soon. But to start thinking about this, blog posts have short-lived page view generating lifespans. So once an article's been out for a while, it tends not to get as many clicks, not as people are page viewing it. So there's this intense pressure, economic pressure, for both blogs and bloggers to keep producing as many posts as rapidly as possible. You can't just write a few good articles and rest on your laurels. You have to keep cranking out content as quickly as possible. Just for a historical comparison, if you think about it, a newspaper has to fill one paper per day with articles. Cable news has to fill 24 hours, 365 days a year with content. On the other hand, blogs and online newspapers have literally a limitless space, and they often draw more traffic by trying to post more stories to sort of fill this infinitude. This leads to what I like to call a perfect storm assaulting the foundations of journalism. This is not a good thing. First is that blogs and bloggers, they're almost all financially strapped. They're earning less than you expect. They're desperate for more page views, either because they want the direct ad revenue from page views, or because if you want to increase your prospects of a buyout, you have to generate a lot of page views to be very popular, to have people interested in purchasing your blog, or poaching you as an individual blogger. So everyone is financially strapped, they're desperate for more page views, and the way to do this is to write articles quickly. But if you're producing articles as quickly as possible, you're really emphasizing the speed rather than the accuracy. And in particular, this does not leave bloggers much time to fact check and verify sources. You're not going to be calling people or going to the street and interviewing. You're not going to be looking up details. You just crank out material as quickly as possible, trying to get your page views as quickly as possible. But it's worse than this. Even if bloggers had time to fact check, page view statistics means there's no financial incentive for being truthful. In fact, misleading articles with salacious headlines often encourage more clicks than do works of authentic journalism. If you see a really bizarre, striking headline, you're prone to click it to see what's going on, even if you're not believing it. This is a dangerous situation in which which is driven by data, right? Data in the form of page views. It's really this quantification reducing the value, value is something that's really hard to pin down, and especially to a single number. So even if you think about trying to quantify value, it's certainly a multidimensional concept. There's value that an article provides to society, provides to individuals, there's journalistic value, there's so many factors that go into what is a valuable article. It doesn't mean just one thing for one people, it's really a complex notion. So to boil it down to a single number, just the raw number of page views, is kind of an atrocity. One specific consequence of this intense pressure to produce page views is that there's sort of this upward propagation of stories through the blog taxonomy. So let's think of it this way. If you think of blogs as kind of broken into three tiers, there's the very local blogs that are focused on a certain geographic area, maybe the town you're from, or a specific interest like wine enthusiasts. These are very local, specialized or focused blogs. Then at the middle, there's the blogs that are attached to newspapers, news sites, not the official newspaper themselves, but the blogs that are attached to them. That's kind of a confusing middle ground because often that level of blog, they'll have the same logo, the URL, even the name of a more reputed journalistic source, like a local newspaper or even a national newspaper. But being a blogger is not the same thing as being a journalist. So for instance, Forbes has official authors that contribute to it, but they also have bloggers that contribute as a sort of freelance way. And the level of scrutiny that passes through the editorial staff is much lower for these blog articles. Even though when you're on these websites, it's not so clear if you're reading the blog articles or the original news stories. And then at the top, we have the official news, things you've heard of like New York Times and Fox News and BBC. So the big actual news. I'll still consider that blogging because it's articles that are posted online. Well, because page views drive so much, all blogs and news sources, even the ones at the very top, they're always hungry for stories. They want attention, they want clicks, they want ad revenue. This creates a fundamental inequality. The supply of actual stories, meaningful events in the world, that is arguably less than the supply of articles written. There's just a lot more being written to try to get people's attention and page views than there's actual important stuff that's happening on any given day. That's a kind of fundamental inequality. This inequality creates a dangerous vacuum. Bloggers are under immense pressure to find stories, or, unfortunately, to create them out of nothing. This leads to an upward flow through this taxonomy of stories. Often, stories start at the bottom rung, which is not to say poor quality blogs, but these local or special interest blogs. The blogs at the bottom of the hierarchy, they're typically underfunded and understaffed. Sometimes there's only one or two people working for them, and they tend to rely on a close-knit community. So for instance, they often publish suggestions from community members or look at leads on social media, and they tend often not to check details and facts. This is not a problem if you think about it. For instance, if you have a wine enthusiast blog and someone recommends some development that's happening in Napa Valley, you might do a story on it. This is not the same kind of journalism that New York Times needs when they're checking some story about Trump. So it tends to be the more specialized ones. They have fewer resources to check facts, but also less incentive to do so because they're not really delving into journalism in the same way. Okay, now let's go to the middle rung of the news of the blogosphere. The middle rung, these are blogs that don't have time or resources to find news stories and investigate. They're not sending people out on the streets as much, so they often just scour the bottom rung of blogs for potentially popular stories. They look for things that might be interesting and trending, and they try to report about them and scoop them up so they can broadcast to a larger audience. Sometimes they'll do this by hedging. They'll say, as reported in, ... and then they'll mention another source. You can't be wrong because even if that lower source that you scoop from is incorrect, the fact that you said it's reported there is still correct, whether or not the story is true. Gets kind of confusing. Okay, so a lot of stories, they'll kind of spread around horizontally within this blogosphere, meaning stories within the middle rung, once they've scooped up the story, other middle rung blogs will start posting about it. They all kind of copy each other and race to get the same stories out because they all want to share in the ad revenue that you get from page views. But often when they do this, you kind of lose that as reported in clause, and suddenly a story is just kind of being reported all over. And once a story is reported in 5 or 6 different places, people just kind of assume it's true, even if it's based on a rumor to begin with. No longer are we kind of trying to be very careful about where it came from. It's just out there on the internet. We all trust it. This is dangerous as you think about it, because everyone is racing, they're working very quickly, and they're not fact-checking. It's all spreading up from the bottom. So that's roughly how stories move from the bottom rung to the middle rung of the blogosphere, but frighteningly enough, they can move further. They can go all the way to the top, ending up at national newspapers. So for instance, a study several years ago found that 89% of journalists, official, professional journalists, they use blogs to research their stories. So even the bloggers, or let's say the journalists at the very top of the blogosphere of the news industry, they look down to these lower rungs to get information. Also, those middle rung bloggers, one of the best ways that they can get very serious traffic, which means money from ad revenue, is if their stories are picked up by national news. So if you're a mid-level blogger, one of the best things can happen is if your story gets picked up by Washington Post, by New York Times, by Fox News, one of these larger news organizations. So it's your economic incentive to try to encourage this as much as possible if you're a mid-level blogger. So what you do is often you'll submit your pieces to news aggregators that are known to be monitored by top-level journalists. And sometimes people develop relationships, and the bloggers will even just directly contact journalists pitching their story, saying, hey, I'm onto something really popular. You guys might want to report on this. It doesn't sound inherently wrong, but this is just means that stories from the very bottom might have somehow percolated up to the middle, and now they're being crammed up to the top level. And the journalists at the top, why would they be interested in this? Well, again, they're hungry for stories. So if someone hands a story to you for free, you don't have to do any work. You just have to report it. Ryan Holiday wrote a very interesting book called Trust Me, I'm Lying, Confessions of a Media Manipulator. So he worked for a while for American Apparel as sort of a guerrilla marketer, and he learned all about the media and ways to manipulate it, wrote this book on it, and he's kind of left that industry, but he gave some really important insight, and I just want to quote about this. So here he's describing, this is a quote describing his experiences deliberately encouraging and exploiting this kind of upward mobility where news starts at the bottom and works its way all the way up to the top and becomes trusted national news. So he says, quote, I can turn nothing into something by placing a story with a small blog that has very low standards, which then becomes the source for a story by a larger blog, and that in turn for a story by larger media outlets. I can't divulge my secrets, but I commonly see uniquely worded or selectively edited facts that paid editors insert into Wikipedia show up later in major newspaper blogs with the exact same wording. Let's think about the consequences of this. Not only is this sort of an opportunity for fake news to work its way into the system, because again, the blogs at the very bottom don't have the incentive or the resources to fact check. They're just really basing things on rumors and local suggestions and social media. So news enters the bottom where it's very easy for anything to enter in, and then it works its way up to the top. At the top, there's supposed to be the more rigorous journalistic standards, but if things have kind of worked their way through the system, often those standards don't kick in and don't apply. So this whole bizarre system, it warps our sense of reality. Let me quote Ryan Holiday again. He says, the news, whether it's found online or in print, is just the content that successfully navigated the media's filters. Since the news informs our understanding of what is occurring around us, these filters create a constructed reality, end quote. So let me just summarize this by pointing out, people tend to think that data helps reveal the truth. But if you think about it, it's also fueling infrastructures like this whole page view media obsession that, in a sense, is concealing the truth and distorting reality. So data is our friend, it helps us understand what's going on, but it also powers these complicated economic forces that can obfuscate things. Now, let me give you a little historical comparison. In the late 1800s, in the US, there was something known as the yellow press. Newsboys on street corners competed for customers. Newspapers figured out they'd sell more newspapers if the headlines were really exciting, even if the articles were total garbage. If you think about it, this was clickbait in its day in the late 1800s. People would shout things, and if it sounded really interesting or exciting or controversial or scandalous, you go and buy the newspaper and you might read it and realize it's just a tabloid and disappointing and you throw it out. But that's just how it worked. The situation got so bad that Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, he described newspapers as, quote, habitually and continually, as a matter of business, practice every form of mendacity known to man, from the suppression of the truth and the suggestion of the false to the lie direct. So he was just saying basically don't trust mainstream media and that there's all this fake news out there. So this might sound kind of familiar. So the problem was people weren't really buying a specific company or brand of newspaper. They were just on the street corner, and whatever shouted at them the loudest and got their attention is where their money went to. This had to change, and indeed it did change. And what happened was, in around this time, so in the early 1900s, the New York Times introduced the subscription model for newspapers. What that meant is now you didn't just go to the corner and buy whichever company's newspaper. You were a New York Times subscriber, and you would be delivered the newspaper every day or whatever period it was. And if they started producing articles that were trash and garbage and not fact-checked, if you lost interest in the articles or didn't trust the organization, you would stop subscribing and they would lose the revenue. So finally, it was in their there was an economic incentive. It was in their direct financial interest to provide good quality journalism rather than just clickbait. This spread throughout the newspaper industry throughout the 1900s. In fact, for pretty much all of the 20th century, newspapers were on the subscription model. If readers are lied or deceived by vapid articles and tantalizing headlines, they just unsubscribe. So we finally have a financial incentive for quality journalism. Okay, so things were bad at the late 1800s. They were improved drastically in the early 1900s and stayed relatively strong. People, mostly trusted the news throughout the 20th century. And now we're back in this world with online news where, again, there's a lot of clickbait and trash. There's basically the newsboys at the street corners shouting out things and getting us to click. Okay, but there is a sign of hope. Things have changed a little bit. In 1997, the Wall Street Journal introduced the subscription model for online newspapers. This is called the Paywall. So this is the idea that rather than just using ad revenue where you can provide all your articles online for free, maybe provide a few for free to get people to sample them, but you require people to subscribe to your online newspaper to pay for the paywall, and then they can access the material and read it. So in other words, what New York Times did in the early 1900s to end yellow journalism and the problem that we had there, the Wall Street Journal did at the end of the 1900s by introducing the online paywall. In the 2000s, this spread, not universally though. So for instance, New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, they all adopted the paywall, so they have the subscription model in the modern time now. But not all did. So for instance, Fox News and MSNBC, they do not have a paywall, so they are fully funded by ad revenue. I'm not claiming that the subscription model is perfect and that it fixes all of the problems of journalism. Because if you think about it, one thing that's saying is people who can afford to are now going to receive a different form of news, of understanding of the world than people who can't. So there are problems of elitism and a sort of democratic fairness that everyone should be provided information. But just to step back, what we have now with ad revenue and clickbaits is very similar to the journalism we had at the end of the 1800s, except now, thanks to data, we can track every individual article. We can see what's drawing clicks, we can see what's going viral, we can really trace the path, we can individualize and customize things to every customer. So it's really kind of the yellow journalism of the late 1800s, but on steroids, those steroids being data analysis. It might help now to hear an inside view of an actual fake news producer. So I'm going to tell you the story of a couple guys who made money writing deliberate fake news, tracking the page views, and they just viewed this as a business. It was, a scam, but they made a lot of money. So this is Paris Wade and Ben Goldman. They were 26 years old in 2016. They ran a website called libertywritersnews.com. It got tens of millions of page views in a 6-month span. That's a lot. 95% of the site's traffic came from the 800,000 followers they acquired on Facebook during this 6-month span. At its peak, their monthly revenue from advertising reached $40,000. Before this venture, they were unemployed restaurant workers. So they didn't have high salaries before. They were literally unemployed when they started this website. And it didn't take too long, and now they're getting up to $40,000 a month running this. So what were they actually doing? Well, they were writing stories. They would just make up headlines and make up stories. But they were smart about it in that they carefully tracked the analytics of their quote-unquote news stories. Meaning they would write a story and then post it, and they would watch what articles are being commented on, shared, what stories seemed to be most trending and going viral, what was getting interest. So they were seeing what was working, what was not, basically running a real-time experiment in fake news. They were measuring and experimenting and exploring what propagates through the the blogosphere what fake news sells, and by selling, I mean drawing clicks. So a typical headline of theirs was, quote, in all caps, "The truth is out. The media doesn't want you to see what Hillary did after losing." Keep in mind, this is 2016. Quote, "Nothing in this article is anti-media, but I've used this headline 1,000 times. Violence and chaos and aggressive wording is what people are attracted to. Our audience does not trust the mainstream media. It's definitely easier to hook them with that. There's not a ton of thought put into it, other than it frames the story so it gets a click. We're the new yellow journalists. We're the people on the side of the street yelling that the world is about to end." Pretty interesting, and pretty interesting that they admitted this. When and where did they admit it? Actually, to a Washington Post reporter. They basically fessed up to their scam and were sort of bragging, saying, look, we were just easily creating fake news and making lots of money, and they didn't really have many qualms about it. In fact, they were rather proud of it. So, to me, the overall punchline is there's a lot to be said about the subscription model, that page view journalism has kind of corrupted journalism. But again, we have to think that there's issues of equality and fairness when you make people pay for news, and not everyone can pay for equal quality news. But at the end of the day, my main punchline here is to realize that our news, what we think of as news, what shapes our perception of reality, as Ryan Holiday said, it's really shaped by data in the form of page view and clicks.